Well, hello, I'm Pastor Mike, and I'm here with Adam, and
Hey.
we're going to have a conversation about last generation theology that started with a video he posted in a private Facebook group. So, Adam, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll get started.
Hey, yeah. So, thanks, Mike. I'm Adam Tonkin. I'm a pastor over in Australia. So our time's a bit different as we worked out when we decided to do this video, but all's working well. I did do a post on a private network. I'm going to actually see if I can get that off and then be able to post it publicly so others can see the context there. And I've seen your video too, Mike, in response to that, which I thought was fairly well done.
So this will probably be video number 3 then. So there's your video, which is about an hour. There's my video, which is about an hour, and I'm thinking maybe we should keep this to about an hour as well, so it doesn't get. In fact, it's exactly 8 o'clock right now, so let's on my end. So let's keep it to about an hour. All right, sorry.
Not a problem. No, that sounds good. So let's do that. Yeah, so I suppose that's what we're doing. We've come together to chat about this because it is an issue. We know it's an issue in the church. If anything, it may be a growing issue from what I've seen. Yeah. But would you say the same there, Mike?
Yeah, I think it goes through phases. Sometimes sometimes it's more discussed than others, but I think with the internet has made it possible, and social media, made it possible to get some of these topics out.
That's true. So I suppose just to clear up, because maybe people who are going to watch this video at least as yet haven't seen my first video. So just to clear up, I think the real gist of what I was trying to do, and it took an hour, so it's a bit long-winded maybe, but I was advocating for the fact that I think last generation theology is actually misunderstood, that it's not accurately portrayed. And that is my stance. I'm open for that to change if I see things that make me go, oh, okay, maybe I misunderstood last generation theology, which is altogether possible. But my stance currently is that I believe last generation theology is misrepresented and misunderstood, also by many who hold it, if you ask me. But that would be going back to Andres and I suppose Wagner and these guys. I actually think what they wrote has been misconstrued even by people who are actually proponents of LGT. So that's kind of my stance as a whole. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, that's probably what we need to figure out, at least in part tonight. And my expectation is that we'll probably have to do several of these videos. And, we could do several conversations and then react to the conversations independently and all that.
I think that'd be good, yeah.
Okay, so you watched my video. I don't know if you want to say anything specifically about stuff I've said in the video. If not, we could just kind of discuss the question of what LGT is supposed to be.
Look, I'm happy to discuss the question, but one thing I suppose that stood out for me in your video, obviously you went over a little bit of history there of Andres, and if I remember correctly, because I watched it a few days ago now and I've done stuff since, there was a little bit on questions on doctrines and stuff there. And so it was a pretty good rundown of history, a brief history on the issue. I actually liked your pyramid. The reason I liked your pyramid is it clarified for me at least a little bit more where you sit, which was a really good clarification for me, because often when I discuss these things with people, it's hard to define where they actually disagree. And I think through our discussions, we'll actually learn more about each other and where we really sit on this. So that'll be helpful. But I really, that bit for me clarified a little bit more where you're at. Which was really helpful for me. The pyramid I'm talking about, vindication at the top.
I have the slides here. If you need to point to them, I can.
Yeah. That was quite helpful because that gave me a clearer. I'm sure it's not clear. I'm sure I could learn more about your position, but yeah, that's the one. So look, justification, sanctification, perfection as possibility, and of course we're talking, and I believe from your presentation, we're talking about perfection of character there. Is that correct?
Yeah, perfection.
Yeah.
Let me make it bigger.
Yeah, for sure. So I found that particularly useful because at least that helped me, at least from, if I've gathered, and I'll say this so that you know where I'm sitting on this. from what I've gathered from this, your main concern is the vindication aspect, in line, obviously in connection with the rest, but that's the main issue. Is that correct? Or
Yes, and also I think that's the order that we need to tackle these on. So because if we go in the opposite order, essentially we're leaving more controversial issues for later. But we should start with the hardest or the biggest question, or the one that's the most difficult, address it, and then if we come to a consensus on that, we can move down the
for sure.
pyramid.
So just to make sure I'm understanding you, you're suggesting we start at the top of the pyramid?
Yeah, so
Okay.
we start here, and if we decide, okay, we either agree or disagree on this, we can move on from there and see what else.
For sure, definitely. No, that sounds like I'm happy to start there, and that sounds fine to me. I'm not necessarily fully prepared to, but I'm happy to just have the discussion. And like you said, if we need to, we can have separate videos and then come together again and discuss.
Yeah.
And try and bring it all together. Do you mind if I just briefly, I won't take long, but just briefly talk about what I mean by misunderstanding with LGT? Because I think also we want to get to what is LGT.
Yeah.
So I'll try it, and hold me up if I'm taking too long, please. Sometimes I can go on too much.
I'll stop you funny thing.
Yeah, thank you. You're gonna have to moderate me a little bit. Good on you, Mike. Just to explain what I mean by this, often when I hear LGT quoted and I hear what people say against it, I listen to it. As somebody who is not adverse to LGT, I'm not sure I'd be willing to say I'm a staunch follower of LGT. I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far, but I'm certainly comfortable with at least what I believe LGT is. So when I hear people talk against it and I listen to their points, often I sit there and I don't think they really know what we believe. I suppose that, or at least what I believe, I suppose, maybe more to the point.
Yeah.
To give a little example, for instance, there's this Bible, is it God's Character in the Last Generation, this new one?
Yeah.
Oh, did I say Bible?
Yeah, it's a Bible. It's a book by the seminary.
Yeah, and it's a great read, and I suggest people have a read of it. But just to give you an idea of where I think the real issue lies, in the second chapter, it's written by Woodrow Whitten, it's contributed by George and I and Angel Rodriguez. It talks about what is last generation theology, what are the historical roots of last generation theology.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to go through it in depth or anything, but I will skip straight to where he starts talking about Wagner, and I'll use that as an illustration. So he pulls out some quotes from Wagner specifically. Mm-hmm. This is a little way into his dissertation, I suppose. And as he pulls these quotes out, he quotes them and shows how Wagner is saying that God doesn't need any humans to vindicate him.
Yeah.
And because we'll be talking about vindication. And then he goes to look at some other quotes where it almost seemingly says the opposite, that God actually needs humans to vindicate him. And he says something like along the lines of basically he's contradicting himself. And here is where I think the issue really lays, because the question in my mind is, was Wagner contradicting himself, or was he explaining two different facets of this idea using those words? In other words, instead of the author saying, can we find a synthesis in his writings for these two concepts, instead we're going to say he's changing his mind. Yeah. And I think that is a misrepresentation. You could certainly do the same with Andreasen. You could do the same if you picked enough of my sermons. You could certainly pick some sermons and go, hey, Adam Tonkin has changed his view on salvation if you look at this sermon and you look at that sermon. But the reality is I haven't at all. I'm just looking at two different aspects. And I think a lot of the times, Ellen White says this about, and I'm not going to go into a big tirade of what Ellen White says, but she says, when the apostles lost their first love, the early church lost its first love.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
She says the problem was a spirit of criticism came in amongst them. And they started seeing looking at each other critically. And I think that's largely the problem we have today. We've become almost, I've found when it comes to these issues, we've become word police. Like if somebody says overcome sin fully or humans will vindicate God, there's this automatic, almost emotional eruption against it rather than this rational. And I'm not saying this about you. I'm just saying I've noticed this in a lot of people. It's almost this irrational eruption of emotion instead of actually going, all right, let me try and understand you. And to give you a personal experience with this that I have regularly is I will say something, and if it's even close to LGT or some concept in LGT, the responses I will get on Facebook or whatever are actually saying or pulling things out of what I said that I never said, never intended. The words aren't even existent in what I said. And I sit there and I think, wow, okay, so there's really a reaction to this that is irrational on an intellectual level. It's actually an emotional reaction. I'm not picking on the people that do that because, hey, we all get emotional sometimes, right? But I find that is common when it comes to any of these discussions that I know you're not like that. I've seen you with other things like that. That's why I was happy to do this with you because I know you keep it more rational, which is good. And I think that has become the same because for instance, when I read a lot of these books and George R. Knight's books, they quote things from Andreasen, right? But when I go read Andreasen's work, guess what's not quoted? All the balancing statements that actually give some nuance and some depth and understanding to the whole context. And I get that, but here's the problem, and let me put it down now in a nutshell. We can do this with the Bible. You could do this, Mike. You know you could. I could do this. I could quote you scripture after scripture, New Testament, Old Testament, and just proof text in a way that gives the idea that we're saved by works. I could do that. You could do it. Anyone can do it. It's done all the time. And then I can proof text equally and say we're not saved by works at all and create another picture. And then you've got these two fighting over this concept. But the reality is the Bible has both of those. And it's the synthesis of those two understandings that brings the truth. And I think quite often with LGT, where we're picking and choosing parts and then someone else is picking and choosing other parts and we're fighting with those rather than going, all right, is there maybe an understanding that Andreasen had or Wagner had or whatever that's actually different to what we're taking from it? For instance, vindication. Andreasen actually says more, at least from my understanding and from my reading of his book, he actually speaks more about God vindicating himself than about humans vindicating God. It's actually way less. Yet the only quotes that are taken from it are where he says, it talks about humans vindicating God. They're the only ones that are taken when this is discussed. And so I find there's this dissonance, this disconnect, this incongruent way of dealing with. Now, maybe I've got Andreasen wrong. I can happily say that maybe I've got Andreasen wrong and he meant things that I don't agree with. I don't know for 100%. It's hard when you're studying someone, you can't sit down and question them. But I think where this discussion has to go is we need to go beyond what these guys said to what people are saying today. And we need to be able to sit down with those people like you and I are doing and going, okay, you say this or you believe this. Do you believe we're saved this way? And if they say yes, go, all right, help me understand how you put those two things together. Help me see that picture. And I think if we can do that, we'll actually get somewhere. Anyway, I've talked a lot. Let me be quiet and let you respond or add or whatever.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned when I see us going in this direction because I feel like we're taking the discussion in a place where we're going to get caught up in so many different issues that we're going to be stuck and not really get to a conclusion. Because we're trying to figure out what exactly did Andreasen mean, who obviously died 60 years ago, and we have no way to question him. And then there's Wagner and Jones, and then there's their entire life story. So maybe when they were 30, they saw things one way. When they were 60, they saw it a different way. So it gets really complicated. And then all the history past that and the different trajectories people took their teachings and so on. I prefer to just get right down to the theology itself and say, okay, here's one version of this theology. In my pyramid, I put this one at the top because I think that's the most problematic.
Yeah.
Does this work or does it not work? Can we dismiss it? If we dismiss this one, we go to the next level and we say, hey, is there a point to this? Do we need to consider this possibility? If not, we go down the theology to the next level. I think my perspective is that overall, like when I look at the entire Adventist church worldwide, and then interacting closely with people on the ground level in churches, and I was part of the GYC movement, went to Bible schools like Black Hills and all these places, had interactions with Amazing Facts Bible School, all these different movements inside the church. How have they, are they helping? Are they, what's the direction they're taking the church? And then there's also movements on the other side, obviously on the opposition. And I would agree with you. I personally think there's been a lot of mistakes made on the side of the people arguing against LGT, and that's actually helped the position of LGT proponents, because they could always say, hey, this person's accusing us of that, but we don't actually believe that. Or they could say, hey, this person is against LGT, but they also don't believe in the sanctuary. So obviously you don't want to listen to them because they don't believe in Adventist doctrine anymore. But the reality is there's a lot of us who believe in the sanctuary, who believe Adventist theology, who fully believe in Ellen White's prophetic gift, all these different elements that LGTers claim to have, but we don't have this other add-ons to our theology that they hold on to. So anyway, so there's all this stuff. So I don't know, that's kind of my approach, because if I focus on the theological concepts, especially when you look at things as a system, like, okay, there's these components, and when they come together, in fact, I used this illustration with somebody. I don't know if you're familiar with the whole evolution debates, Michael Behe, the irreducible complexity, the Mousetrap example, and all that stuff. Anyway, Michael Behe had this example, and I'm not advocating for the value of the example or the argument or anything, but I'm just using this as an illustration. So Michael Behe had this mousetrap, and he said, look, you have this thing, and then if you take parts off of it, it doesn't catch mice anymore. Like, you have to have the spring, and you have to have this hammer, and you have to have the base, all of them together to catch the mouse. Well, when it comes to theological systems, they're kind of like that. Like, when you have all the components together, it does something. When you take a component away, it no longer does that. It might do something else, but it becomes a whole different system of thought. And when you approach it this way, you're not stuck in trying to figure out, hey, here's a paragraph. Did the author mean this, or did the author mean that? And here's another book where he says something else, and how do you counter that and balance those out? If we focus on the theology, we could just deal with the concepts directly. And then if we want to discuss further, like, okay, we've figured out the theology, we agree and disagree with this. Now, can we trace this theology back to Andres, and can we trace it back to Wagner or Jones or Ellen White or anybody? Or is it something that happened more recently? We could discuss those later, but the theology is more easy to deal with because it's just concrete theoretical ideas that come together in a certain way. So anyway, that's kind of my approach to this.
Look, I totally agree with that, actually. Maybe I didn't make that clear in what I was saying. As I was sharing that, I was just sharing the nuances that I believe exist. But ultimately, I think you're right. We could spend all day trying to work out, we could spend a year trying to work out, what did Andreasen actually mean? What did this person actually mean? But in the end, I think if we just bring it to now, bring it to today, here's yourself, here's myself. We've got Bibles. I'm a big believer in Ellen White. I think you can easily prove this stuff with Ellen White. However, I would rather keep Ellen White out of it.
Yeah.
That's my view. Let's use our Bibles. Let's use our own understanding of the Bible, because then you're narrowing that field and making it easier to dissect and move through.
Hey, so I think the question I have then is, Uh, I want to try to understand what is your attachment to the title Last Generation Theology. And the reason I'm asking is because you could have words take on whole different meanings depending on how they're used. Like, for example, the word Catholic, right?
Yes.
We all belong to the Catholic Church in a sense, if by the Catholic Church you mean universal.
Universal,
right?
yeah.
All true Christians belong to the universal church. However, in conversation, when you're talking to somebody about the Catholic Church, the tendency is to assume a certain denomination unless you clarify ahead of time what you mean, So we could talk about last generation theology, and hey, all of us agree that there's going to be a last generation, and that this last generation, probably say 80% of us agree that this last generation is going to be special in some way. It's some of the other stuff where things start to diverge. Maybe explain a little bit of what's your attachment to this label or this term itself.
Okay, probably the easiest way to explain that is just tell you how I even got attached to this LGT itself. I studied my Bible like anyone else, and the writings of Ellen White. They've had an influence on me, no doubt. And as I studied different things, I came to certain positions, and as I started sharing those positions, I first heard about LGT actually not through my own research. I heard about it because I started getting accused of it by a few other ministers like this, and I was like, "What is LGT? What are you talking about? What is last generation theology?" Like, I had no idea what it was. I'd never read Andreasen. I didn't know much about Andreasen. I hadn't read his letters to the churches. I hadn't read any of his stuff really, not that I knew of anyway. So that actually spawned me to go, all right, I need to find out what I'm being accused of here. So I asked, and they said, oh, Andreas, and they started telling me about Andreas. And so I thought, all right, I need to get this book. I need to read what I'm being accused of here. So I have to admit off the offset, when I read Andreasen's works, I had an idea. I wasn't looking for holes necessarily. I was just looking to see if he agreed with what I was saying.
Yeah.
And I found that to be so for the most part. I mean, I didn't necessarily want to put things in the ways he put it. Some things the way he said it, I was like, I wouldn't say that, but I'm not necessarily in disagreement with the whole picture. So that started it. And I found at first I denied LGT, but I kept getting accused of it. It got to the point after I'd read it, I still went, you know what, I don't have a problem with this, but I don't like being labeled. So I still disagreed with it and said, I'm not an LGT proponent. And then eventually I just got sick of arguing. And so I went, whatever, LGT, if that's what everyone thinks I believe, that's where I'm going. And so I just kind of adopted it out of, I'm just sick of arguing anymore. Okay. I'm not interested.
Okay. So then the next question is, what exactly about last generation theology feels like it's the essence of what it means to, like, in terms of theology, like what concepts does it bring across to you?
Look, to me, it's first of all, I think primarily prophetic. Now, what do I mean by that? I just believe that God's revealed to us through prophecy what's coming and what Jesus is going to be doing with his people and with the world and all that stuff. So I actually see it as just a simple breakdown of what God's going to do. And there's nuances within that, but that's all I see it as. And I also see it as the cap or the ending, so to speak, of a much larger picture of the gospel picture that started way back when Jesus died, or even before that, if you will, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. But I don't really see it as anything abnormal or strange or estranged from Adventist doctrine. I actually feel it's very much in line with our fundamentals, rightly understood. I find it's very biblical, and it's more a prophecy. It's a prophetic. It's just because of prophecy, we know some things that are going to happen, and that's how I view it. Does that make sense? Was that clear? You might want to ask another question if it's not concise.
Well, what you said makes sense, but now I'm wondering, what is it that you're thinking about as being prophetic? Are you thinking about this this harvest of Christ-like character? That's the prophecy, or what exactly is being fulfilled?
Okay, so maybe if I get a little bit more specifically LGT-ish on what I believe that is. For me, as I look through the prophets in the Old Testament, there's this constant move, and it's almost in all the prophets, minor and major, that you see a move. You see when the Messiah is going to come, but then you also see that after the Messiah is going to come, God's going to do a special work in his people. We call it the New Covenant. And of course, that started after Jesus came, right? Jesus was the New Covenant. And part of that New Covenant was he'd write the law in our hearts and whatnot. But I actually, from my understanding of reading the prophets and then lining that up with Revelation, which really is just taking bits of the prophets and the law and the prophets and putting them in an end time order almost, to give us a bigger picture of the last days. I see this promise of God that just prior to his coming, he's going to establish Israel in a way. Now, a lot of people attribute these prophecies to after the millennium, when the New Jerusalem comes down. I think that is a type, but I think there's a type that comes before that, and it's seen in the people. This is the city without walls. And in the people, it tells us constantly that through this people, through this establishing of the new covenant with God's people, all the Gentiles will come. Now, I see that as fulfilled in the time of Christ, when the Gentiles started coming, the preaching of Paul and these apostles. But I also see an end time fulfillment where God's going to do that again with the latter rain. So it's not really a majorly new thing. It's really just the final event. But I believe this has happened before in the early rain. I believe God used that and pulled some people out and transformed their hearts and then brought people to God. And I believe the end time's just going to be that final time that happens. And there will be a people who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. And those two things are very important, because there's no keeping the commandments of God without Jesus. So does that answer the question?
Yes and no, because I think until I ask more pointed questions and we get more specific.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I don't really have a problem with most of what you just said either. So then the question is, what will all this accomplish? So like, for example, how does this relate to the close of probation?
Okay, close of probation, if you ask me, is not a huge thing. Close of probation is just the event where everyone's made a decision. God's done his thing. Everyone's made a decision for or against God that's alive on earth. And then Jesus just finishes that ministry in heaven. He ceases to do that because he's coming to take his people home and defend his people. So that's all close of probation is to me. It's a bit like Noah's Ark. God spent a lot of time trying to get people on the ark before it came to the point where everyone had solidified their decision. And then God said, all right, everyone's made the decision. I'm just going to act. So I think close of probation is it's really just a way of explaining the next step. When no one's going to make a decision anymore past what they've already decided, God just goes, all right, I can finish this. We're done. Yeah. That's how I view it.
Yeah. So then already based on like my classification of the topic, I don't see that anywhere being near LGT, because LGT, the way it's commonly understood by the top proponents of LGT these days, is that probation closes as a specific point in time when God says, okay, I'm leaving the Holy of Holies. Jesus leaves the most holy place. He stops interceding, and then there's some duration of time, whatever it is, a year or less or more, nobody really knows.
Yeah.
And then there's this group of people, the 144,000, and nobody really knows if they're symbolic or literal. Actually, people do know, but they don't agree with each other over it.
Yeah.
I've been a participant in meetings where top LGBT leaders were fighting with each other. Like they would take turns, and we say it's literal, and we say it's symbolic, and argue back and forth, which was
Yep.
entertaining to say the least.
Yeah.
But anyway, so probation closes, and then there's this duration of time, and then these people are basically given over to Satan to do whatever he wants, because this is his last chance to trip him up and get back at God and make his case. So you're nowhere near that idea, because you don't even acknowledge the close of probation in those terms. Like you're not saying, okay, here's a deadline, and after the deadline, time keeps on going, and there's no more sinning after that, and people have to resist Satan and overcome and all this. So I don't know. Like, I mean, to me, everything you've said, I would never label that LGBT, because it's just basic. I mean, I think I could probably find people in most other denominations that would agree with my.
I agree 100%. Like,
so it's not even this issue, really.
Well, I think you're right, and I think like sometimes what people get into, and this is not just LGBT, this is anyone who's interested in last prophecy. Sometimes I think we try to go beyond what's revealed, and even if we're right, I don't see the fruitfulness of going there. Like, let's go what's revealed, and let's just stay there, and let's not try and put together. We have there's an obsession I've noticed, and this is not just LGBT, this is others as well, an obsession with prophecy to the point that we're trying to fill in all the gaps, and I think we don't need to do that. Personally, I think we just take what is, accept that, and walk with that. That's just my personal view. Otherwise we get lost in the muck.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the conflicts that people have had over LGBT result from some of this this constructs that they've built. Because if somebody is going to have this complete victory over sin and defeat Satan after the close of probation, all this, then sin has to be something very tangible. So I believe I've talked to you before, and you said that you don't agree with the definition of sin that most LGTers hold, which is that it's just the external stuff, or maybe not the external stuff, but the voluntary stuff. I don't know if you've changed your position on that or not, but I know some time ago you kind of disagree with that.
Yeah, look, I suppose to clarify, I don't remember what we said last time and what the context was, so maybe I should just clarify where I stand. As far as sin is concerned, I think the Bible's clear that sin is both a choice and a state. I think, and I actually don't see LGT denying that. I have seen people, proponents of LGT, denying that, but I actually don't see like it from Andreasen denying that or anything like that.
Did you have a chance to read the letters or no? The letters.
Yeah, I did. I read them rather quick though, so because I had a lot on, so I really need to go through them again.
The major problems Andreasen had with the QOD, that and the nature of Christ.
Yes.
So to him, this idea of sin being a nature became an issue, because it wouldn't really make sense to then argue the rest of his case.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a question I would have that unfortunately Andreasen can't answer, but maybe you know something you said that would answer it. I did read that, and the question that came up in my head, I very much deliberately try not to be critical of people these days, because I've done that too much in my life. So I try to think about what they said and ask myself, what are the possibilities of meaning that are here? And so with Andreasen and his letters, my question was, is Andreasen, and I don't know the answer to this, is Andreasen denying sin as a state altogether, or is he denying that sin as a state is the problem? And that was where my mind went, and I don't know the answer to that question. I'll be honest with you, I don't know where his head was at that. But the answer, if you answer that question, you can answer that question two different ways. I just gave two options, and they've both come to very different conclusions. If he's denying that we're in a sin state at all, then I would have a problem with what he's saying, because I think the Bible reveals that, and I've certainly seen that without Christ, I am helplessly enslaved to sin.
Yeah.
I've experienced that. But if his meaning was, and again, I don't know the answer to this, if his meaning was, I'm not saying denying sin as a state, and I know a lot of LGBT proponents don't deny sin as a state, but when it comes to salvation, they'll talk about sin as a choice as the primary issue. I would tend to agree with that sin is, and I'll tell you why. I believe that Christ's death on the cross takes care of our sinful state, that we're not held accountable for that. His death in our place covers that. And you'll see that in Old Testament imagery where lamb slain just because you've got a disease or something. That's something you didn't choose that. You didn't wake up and go, hey, let's have a disease. You know what I mean? So I think that imagery is certainly taught in the Old Testament, that we have a problem that is not chosen by us. But when it comes to what are we accountable to, it's actually not that. It's actually, well, it is to a degree, because we still need to choose Christ and accept Christ if we're going to have that covered. But I think ultimately what we're accountable to is the choices we make. And ultimately that choice is whether to accept Christ as our Messiah or reject him as our Messiah. And I've given Andreas and room, I suppose, in my mind to choose that maybe that's what he meant in that circumstance. And he wasn't trying to deny that we are helpless sinners without Christ and that we are unworthy, unfit for heaven just by birth. So I'm being kind to Andreas on that because I don't know the answer.
Yeah, so I think Andreas would agree with you there, because he and most of his proponents do agree that we need Christ to overcome sin. But I think the difference is, and again, it's hard to differentiate Andreas from everybody else that has built on him since.
Yes.
And a lot of today's picture of LGBT that most of us work with is probably at least as much a product of people like Freebie and maybe Douglas and a few other, maybe more than Andreas. But
yeah,
the key element that they're worried about is, we need Christ to overcome. They don't deny that. But the question is, what part of what we do is actually labeled sin? So, for example, they usually try to differentiate between temptation and reaction to temptation. So, say I see a beautiful woman walking by, and I have this physical impulse to lust after her. But at some point, that impulse comes into my conscious mind, and I have a choice to go along with it or to resist it. And for the LGBT proponent, the idea is no, it's not a sin until I choose to give in to the temptation. So, so they make this differentiation. Now, I don't have a problem necessarily with this differentiation, but the question is that all there is to sin? And again, I think part of the problem with this whole debate is that the opposite view, which is the people that say sin is your nature, I think go too far in the other extreme as well. And a lot of them don't actually realize that they're building on a lot of philosophical presuppositions that they're getting from Catholics and evangelicals that we actually don't agree with theologically. They believe in the soul, belief in certain. Anyway, it's hard to get complicated to get into, but I think a lot of the opponents of LGBT have kind of succumbed to some of this other stuff that has affected them on the other side. My only point with this is that I think because of Andreassen's end goal, which I believe is this idea that we have this battle at the end that we're supposed to fight and win. He put a lot more emphasis on certain things than the average person would have put, like things like the nature of Christ, the nature of sin, and some certain other aspects about the book Questions on Doctrine that I think you and I, had we read the book Questions on Doctrine 60 years ago, it wouldn't have bothered us as much as it bothered him. But I think it bothered him because of his ultimate goal in his whole theology, which is this idea of vindication that I brought up. Obviously, unless we have a conversation with him, we can't prove that he had this whole picture in his head, but That's where things seem to be, at least from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And even if not, that's where they've gotten with
Yeah.
everybody else since this time.
I think this is important what you're saying, Mike, and I think because what essentially we're talking about, and you talked about a system before, you used the mousetrap and everything, but essentially what we're talking about, I think we term it, is systematic theology, right? In other words, the whole, everything affects the next step. And I think you are right. I think you are right that Andreasen reacts to this in that way because of its effect. The question, I suppose, and we don't need to go into this, but there is also a nuanced question we need to ask ourselves when we go into that area, is did Andreasen do it because he just felt, I have to come to this conclusion, or did he do it because he knew that that conclusion was right, at least in his mind, and he did believe that they were misusing the first part? In other words, you know, we can't ask him, like you said. So at the end of the day, I afford him the room to go, hey, I don't really know what he meant. I can only go by what was actually said. So, I mean, this issue, for instance, this issue over sin that we've just been talking about, what is sin? I certainly think we need to acknowledge that sin, to some degree, is a state that we're in. I would find it very hard to prove. In fact, in my mind, at least at present, I'd find it impossible to prove that our sin as a state is condemnable after accepting Christ. And I think this is where LGT, at least as I understand it, takes a stance and goes, because our state's not condemnable, that's not the building block which we build on. We acknowledge that's there. We acknowledge that's a reality. But what does the Bible teach us about sin and how we react to it and how God does something about it? And so I think from the very earliest times, you know, Adam and Eve, first of all, it was a choice they made. But the question is, do we have choice after them? And I would say yes, because Jesus is the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And because Christ has covered the muck and the slavery, if I can use that word, that we've come into in sin, he looks past that reality and he tries to bring us to that position where we can make a choice. And I think even the very first thing we see after Adam is the story of Cain. And God sits down with Cain and he presents him with a choice. So Cain is not inextricably, God doesn't sit down and go, look, you can't help yourself, mate. There's just no helping yourself here. You're helpless, you're hopeless, you're a slave. Now, while that is true, that may be true, that's not how God addresses it. He actually says, look, sin wants to rule over you. You need to make a choice and rule over it. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of what we'd ask the question if we'd only ever read that. Well, how do we rule over sin if we're slaves to sin, right? We've got to go to the rest of the Bible for that. But the point is, when I go through scripture all the way through, I see that some people chose to rely on God and they ended up not walking in sin and they ran away from sin. Others struggled more, and that's okay. We're all different circumstances. Some of us come to Jesus later, some of us come to earlier, and we've got all those wonderful stories that show people who did horrid, evil things and then came to Jesus right in their last, you know, some of these evil kings, and came to Jesus right at the end, and God just went, yeah, okay, I forgive you. So we've got that wonderful characteristic of God. So we've got to be very careful. And I think sometimes people who believe in LGT lift up false standards, like everyone's got to measure to this right now or else, or you've got to measure to what I've measured to or else, and they become, but I don't think that's an LGT unique thing. That's a legalism thing. That's LGT or not, you're going to find that same attitude. So my point being, let me finish. Let me stop, is just that when I look through scripture, sin becomes a choice, and it's a choice in light of the Messiah. Like before that, it's not really a choice. It's only a choice in light of the Messiah.
I think what you're describing would be categorized as prevenient grace in like Protestant terminology.
Yeah, that'll work.
Yeah. And I think it kind of addresses the issue, but I think it's a little bit not quite where a lot of times the debate is with the LGBT people. And I actually wanted to say something for what you were commenting on a few seconds ago.
Mm.
Um, in that, like a lot of the LGBT proponents spend a lot of their time thinking about this ending game that I keep talking about, because they're sort of saying like, look, things like evangelism, things like um, helping other people are not so important, because all that does is just continue history. What really matters is we need to get to the stage where God can bring things to an end, because He could trust us to face Satan on our own, and not on. They don't say on our own in terms of like God isn't going to help us, but without making any more mistakes. So I don't know, maybe part of the problem is that you haven't been exposed to enough of the LGBT movement, the Adventist Church, to see those elements and the effect it has on how people think about everything else, and how they relate to salvation, and how it affects churches. Like, uh, you go from church to church, and people are exposed to various LGBT proponents, and it ends up having an impact on the church that it ends up falling on the local pastor to deal with. So, somebody puts a video on the internet, or somebody comes by and does a week of prayer or whatever and teaches LGBT, and they leave, and yet the pastor's left behind to try to deal with these people that are now weighed down with the fact that they have to get to this level, and the whole universe is waiting for them to overcome, and all this stuff. So all these elements are in play here. But anyway, just a quick thought on the sin issue that I think a lot of times we miss is I think probably the best label for it is to say it's a sort of a circumstantial concept of victory over sin. So I don't know. I'll use an illustration, and you tell me if it works for you or not. It might not work, but this is an illustration I use in my book as well. Um, I don't know if you had a chance to see it, to get to that part, but basically, like, imagine that somebody moved over to one of the self-supporting schools up on top of a mountain, and they're over there teaching classes all day, working in the garden in the afternoon, spending time with family at night, day in and day out, to the point where they essentially overcome all their stuff, like whatever it is they're struggling with. They're no longer falling, they're no longer making mistakes. They could almost look at their life and say, hey, I'm not sinning anymore. Now, obviously, they know not to do that, because that's wrong, and because the minute you do that, you're becoming proudful. But overall, they're not consciously making any more mistakes. They're no longer giving into any of their old habits, any of the old things that they used to struggle with, right? So here's a situation of a person that, based on the way a lot of LGTers describe victory over sin, you could say this person is getting there, or it's pretty close to that level. Now, imagine this person was actually here on a visa, from a student visa from somewhere, and basically the government says, sorry, we can't let you stay anymore, and they get sent back to someplace like Syria or someplace overseas where they're in the middle of a war, and they have nobody there, and essentially they have no work, no way to survive, no money, nothing, and they're trying to get by from one day to the next, and to support their family. And now they have a whole different set of temptations to deal with, and whatever victory they obtain here has nothing to do with what their life is like in that situation. Now, obviously, God could help them be victorious there as well. That's not the question. The issue I'm bringing up. The issue I'm bringing up is that we have this concept of a victory over sin within this sort of false environment. Like, okay, this person, they have this easy life, everything's fairly reasonable, and everything goes great, and they think they're overcoming, but they don't know what they would do if they were living the life this other person was living, that probably just lives down the street for them, who has all kinds of problems that they have to face every day. So it kind of like one of the issues with this idea of sin being simply willful choice is that it neglects what we would do in much harder circumstances. But LGTers want to take these people and then throw them into the wilderness with Satan, So why is it that just because I can overcome sin at the top of a mountain in a self-support institution, how is that going to help me when I'm in the midst of the biggest battle of my life type of thing? It just doesn't quite add up, because they're keeping sin up here and they're not going down to the roots of it, the deep trenches of the character, where you know you don't know, like, if you're overcoming there, because you're not facing temptations on that level. So a lot of times I use another analogy. I use the iceberg. Like, if you see an iceberg, on top of the water you have this tiny tip, but underneath there's this massive body of ice that's 100 times bigger than what you see on top. And a lot of times when it comes to sin, the stuff that we see, the willful stuff that we deal with every day when we make those choices, is just the tip of the iceberg. The character goes so much deeper, and we don't actually know. We can quite see exactly how we're progressing when it comes to becoming better people at the level of the character. So the problem is that once you look at sin from this angle, the whole idea that LGTers are dealing with, where they're trying to speed up the second coming of Christ by overcoming sin so that they could face this final battle, it just kind of falls apart, because now it's kind of almost outside of your control anymore, because you don't know if your character is really changing or not, just because you're maybe refusing to take that extra piece of chocolate or whatever. So these are the kind of issues that make the whole rationale of LGT just seem very superficial and shallow, and it ends up actually having negative effects on people's spiritual lives, because it just doesn't work at the practical level.
Yeah, 100%. Those are good analogies. And I'd like to have say a few things towards that. I think one of the traps people who believe LGT fall into is trying to answer the myriad of questions that are leveled at them. And so they have to come up with, and I got into this trap a while back, where you have to come up with all these examples and ideologies and stuff to explain, because you're trying to help somebody who asked this question. But the reality is the question didn't need to be answered in that way. The question was coming from a wrong viewpoint. And so what should have happened is they should have, if they could, correct the viewpoint. So when I think of overcoming sin, of course, I think overcoming sin's possible. I think it's possible now. You don't have to wait till some last generation. It's been possible since Christ. It's been possible before Christ. Christ has always offered that to those who put their trust in him. And it's a growth. It's a journey for each of us. And that journey looks different for each of us. Some people manage to, their faith in God seems to just grab hold so fast that within a year, they look like someone who's been in the church for 50. Yeah. Whereas someone who's been in for 50 years is still clamoring. Are they less saved? No, I wouldn't say that. I just say they're on their journey and they're learning to trust God, and we are to help them in every way we can. But I would, at essence, think we sometimes overcomplicate and convolute things to the point that it becomes so messy we don't know what we're talking about. When it comes to overcoming sin, it's not really, I would suggest it has nothing to do with circumstance, and it has nothing to do with where you are. Now, don't get me wrong, that can sound very wrong. I acknowledge that different circumstances create different difficulties and challenges. But I think ultimately, learning how to overcome sin, once you learn biblically how to overcome sin, circumstances don't actually change anything. At least in the end, but they will initially as you learn to navigate and learn about your weaknesses. But I think overcoming sin is actually really simple. It's not a focus on sin. That's always a recipe for disaster. It's not a focus on our weakness or our inability, although we do need to acknowledge that to have daily justification, to see our need of Jesus. But I think it's actually learning there's, I suppose, two elements. The first is learning to trust Jesus, take him at his word. I can do that today. I can do that right now. The second is learning that no matter where I am, or what temptation is thrown about me that I learn to be on guard. Peter, what does Peter say? He says, be sober and diligent. So the idea is you have to actually be on guard. We're in a war. So I've got to wear the armor. In other words, I can't walk about my day pretending there's no spiritual warfare. I have to be mindful of this. And that takes some time. I know for me, it's taken time, and I'm still learning to be mindful that no matter where I'm doing, whether I'm having fun with my family or working or whatever it is, I have to be mindful. There's a devil trying to take me down. Now, if he does manage, I can turn that into victory by turning to the merciful God straight away. So I can have victory even when I fall, But how do I learn not to fall? It's learning to run to Jesus, not after I fall, but before I fall. In other words, I run to the throne of grace. I boldly come before the throne of grace where I can find two things: mercy, but I also find grace to help in time of need. That's Hebrews 4. So what I've learned is my circumstances will affect me. And even things that are going on, so their circumstances or places I'm in, they're all circumstantial. They can all affect me, but I don't need to learn how every circumstance. I need to learn how to stay with Jesus. That's my only goal, my one singular goal, no matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, no matter what circumstance faces me. My one goal is to learn to be on guard and to run to Jesus consistently. And I believe that is what creates an overcomer. Whatever stage you're at, whether you've overcome all your sins or whether you've overcome only a few, it really doesn't matter, because you're saved as soon as you run to Jesus. So that for me, that's much simpler. I don't have to worry about all this stuff, and I don't have to worry about all my weaknesses. I have to worry about two things: be on guard, or if I can put it simpler, keep my eyes on Jesus. And whenever I'm challenged, run to him. And if I do that, I win. And I've found that to be true today. If I do that, I've had the question leveled at me numerous times because I've claimed to believe LGT is all right. They say, are you without sin? Now, that's a trap question, because you can't answer that. There's no right answer to that if you try and give a yes or no. There is no right answer. You will always get held down. But I learned, and Prescott actually showed me this. I learned this from Prescott. He said, because he answered that kind of same question, it was basically leveled at him, and he said, I'll tell you what, when I'm looking to Jesus and relying on Jesus, sin has no power over me. When I fail for whatever reason to look to Jesus and rely on Jesus, that's when sin beats me, but that's when I get up and go to him immediately for mercy. So that's kind of the answer I come up with for myself, and I found it to be true. When do I fall? I'll tell you honestly, when I actually put this into practice, I don't fall when I'm tempted. To my own shame, sometimes, and I have it, I'm not on guard at all. I'm not even thinking about the spiritual battle. I'm not mindful of Christ in any way. I've got carried away with something, and I allow circumstances to affect me. In those times, I go to God for mercy. I don't go, oh, I'm lost now because, I stuffed up. And that to me is the simpler way of looking at it. We sometimes convolute it and we come up with all these pictures of how we overcome sin over time. And that's okay, I guess, in its own right. But I like to keep it simple. I just have to keep my eyes on Jesus and trust in him and run to him every time I am tempted. And if I do that, I'm going to be okay because he's strong enough. Does that make sense? Or
yeah, it makes sense, Adam. That's not the issue for me, because what you're describing is just basic Christianity 101 that I don't think has anything to do with LGT really. Like maybe we're in a situation in our church where people have gotten so far to the other extreme, to the cheap grace side of things, to the point where any kind of basic hey, there's a way to like overcome. We're not, like, the point of the gospel isn't just so that, instead of the Catholics that do indulgences when they sin, we just like say, ask Jesus for forgiveness, or just believe he forgives us, and we can keep going with our sinful lives. There's more to the gospel than that. But that's just the most basic gospel formula that has been around for 2000 years and beyond. It has nothing to do with Adventism or LGT or anything. It's just, pretty much anyone who's a genuine Christian would agree that there's a progression in the Christian life and all this. The part where I see LGT coming in is this idea of a hastening of Christ's return by actually gaining this victory so that God can return. So basically, like when you're talking here about what it means to you to gain a victory over sin. But as you're doing this, you're not really conscious of where you are on this ladder. So you're not saying, okay, perfection is right here, I'm right here, and I'm making this progress, and pretty soon I'm going to reach here, and I got to do everything I can to reach here so that Jesus can come, kind of thing. But in the LGT framework, it is built like that because it's an explanation, like I said in my previous video. It's meant to be an explanation for why we're still here. And it creates this sort of vicious triangle of concepts that when they come together, they end up creating a very frustrating Christian experience for the people that get sucked into it, because they're constantly like struggling to gain some victory, and every time they fall, they're saying, okay, I'm not making the progress I need to make so that Jesus can return. So, and then sure, if I lived in 20 years ago or 100 years ago, God might be okay with me being at this stage, but because I'm living at the end of history, right at the close of probation, I need to go the extra mile. And because they cannot go that extra mile and get that victory that they're expecting to get, they just give up. When there's no reason to give up, because God accepts them as they are and He's working with them and helping them progress and grow spiritually. So these are the elements that are problematic. When people get caught up in this mental triangle of trying to become perfect so that the Jesus can return and all this stuff can happen, So I don't know how to fix this in our conversations, because it feels like we're kind of going in a circle in this sense. Because I understand that you have an issue with people, trying to make it seem like there's no kind of victory, any kind of cheap grace, any kind of antinomianism. I understand you have a problem with that, and I think Adventists always had a problem with that. But to me, it seems like if we're going to have this extra element called last generation theology, it needs to have something different that is contributing something more, or else there's no point in using the label, because we're just talking about basic sanctification or whatever. So yeah, so I'm not sure where to go from here in that sense, because we're kind of stuck a little bit in terms of this definition of LGT.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And the interesting thing, and you may have heard me say it before, I really don't think LGT is different from Adventism. It's just an avenue that's explained, that's from my perspective. So when you say it doesn't feel like you're saying anything that needs to be labeled LGT, I'm 100% like, yeah, man, I agree with you. Yeah. I don't think it needs that label.
Well, here's the thing. I talked to other LGTers who say that as well. They say LGT is basic Adventism, but then they do bring all these elements in that are just, first, they're not biblical, and second, they're unhealthy. They're psychologically damaging elements. So, but you don't hold those elements. So then somehow you got to differentiate yourself from all this other stuff that things that you don't agree with.
I hear you and I agree with you. I've tossed and turned over this one for a long time because I keep getting the label anyway, even if I don't talk about it. And look, the reason is, and I think the hard bit is, and you're talking about vindication earlier, which we haven't really talked a whole lot about. Maybe in our next video, we should focus on vindication.
Sure. We're crossing the hour mark, so it's probably...
Okay. Yeah, maybe we should just close off for now. Yeah.
Finish it up, but we don't want to keep people.
Yeah, for sure. Essentially, I think the issue here is sometimes what happens. I think there's what LGT is and what people end up making it. And I'm even talking about people who believe it, right? And I think we've got into this trap of defense, self-defense. And what happens when we're in self-defense is someone asks a simple question like, how can you believe will be perfect and yet not know it? And so that's a trap, really, because I don't think we need to get into that. But we get into this trap of trying to create these scenarios to explain how that's possible. What happens is we end up always talking about these scenarios that end up with a focus on, or a seeming focus at least, on performance. And this is where people start, look, I'll tell you, LGT is absolutely deadly to a legalist. You get a legalist to believe LGT and you've got a deadly combination there. But I think the reality is we need to have these talks like we're having now. And I think we need to draw back and realize that it's not actually as complicated as we're making it out to be, or even LGTers are making it out to be. I think we need to back up a little bit and go, what is true? Because I do believe, by the way, and this is why we need to talk about vindication, I do believe that overcoming in that last time will be part of what vindicates God's name. I don't believe it's something we do for God. I believe it's something God does for himself. And I would make the argument, and Drayson believe that as well. But anyway, I don't want to get in that conversation now, because maybe next time we can talk directly about vindication. But
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. That sounds like a good, good plan.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered quite a bit, I guess. I think maybe we should take a few days and think about everything and figure out what to fix. But definitely, we've got to spend some time on vindication.
Yeah.
But yeah, hey, thanks for taking the time, and
thank you, Mike.
We'll do this again soon.
Yeah, appreciate your ministry, buddy.
God bless.
God bless.